Welcome to the Numerical Tarot. A new tarot paradigm. An alternative to tradition. An axial system of archetypal crystallography. A transculturally anthropomorphized, life-biased binary influence calculator. A wisdom system and archetype enhancer, with harmony of interpretation throughout. The content of all the videos in this series are excerpts, edits and brief summaries from the eBooks All Things Are Numbers and All Things Are Patterns, links below. For a more complete explanation of each idea, additional reading might be helpful. Hopefully the basic ideas come across enough to pique your interest in trying this alternative approach to tarot. Before we start, let me apologize up front for the lack of imagery that you will find in this video. I just couldn't come up with very many illustrations or diagrams. So you'll have to stare at the few I had for a longer than desirable length of time before something new comes along, which might make things a bit boring to look at, but hopefully still good to listen to. In the previous video, we put forth the idea of engrayment as a more accurate word for describing the unity of oneness that we get when we moor beyond opposites in pursuit of divinity. And we ended with the suggestion that it is okay to live in, and deal with, a life of opposites and humanity. But in living with and dealing with the opposites that make up humanity, the question of what is good and what is bad takes on a significant importance. Especially in the world of tarot and tarot card readers. So, does the tarot have good and bad cards? Does life have good and bad experiences? This is a very tricky subject that often leads to endless debate between opposing points of view. As with all debates, there are always two sides to every coin. So what are the two sides of this debate about the good and bad of, well, anything? Personally, I try to not use the words good and bad when talking to people about tarot or anything else. However, there have been times when I have talked to people who tell me it's okay, go ahead, they do it. And one will notice that there are places in this study where I indeed do go ahead and use the words good and bad. At the same time though, there are other people who want to convince me that there is no such thing as good and bad, and that I shouldn't use such terms at all. But, while I'm on board with the infinite subjectivity of good and bad, I don't necessarily agree that good and bad don't exist at all, at least, perceptually, within any individual's subjective sense of life and living. Because of that opinion, I see people who want to convince me that there is no such thing as good and bad as somewhat comical, in the hypocritical way they portray the imposing of one's subjective sense of good and bad as, well, a bad thing to do. When it comes to the subject of whether there is any such thing as good and bad, some people will try to convince me that things like good and bad do exist, but see the acknowledgement of them as the source of all suffering and therefore an obstacle to enlightenment. Some preach detachment from all notions of duality as a means of reducing or eliminating the effects of life upon a life. As a remedy to liking or not liking something, and thereby suffering from not getting what we like or getting what we don't like, they suggest a life lived in unity, where there are no such perceptions or preferences, much like we suggested in the video previous to this one. Is such a life possible, or is this a form of delusional denial? It is true, there would be no good or bad, or right and wrong within the unity of oneness where such oppositions are eliminated from view. Thus, enlightenment, they say, is in the unity of oneness, not the dualities and rivalries of good and bad. To that point, I agree. Such a perspective is at least not hypocritical. There is indeed no good or bad in the unity of things, where we would be considered divine. This would be what we have come to call engrayment in our previous video. But I believe there is good and bad in the diversity of things, where we are human. Yes, in the world of unity, there is no rivalry between things because everything is one, so values are never applied to anything. However, in the world of diversity, there is rivalry between things, because things tend to bump into each other and step on each other's toes, in life-affirming or life-detracting ways. So, to sort out one thing from another, values are applied, individually and collectively, thus creating the notions of priority, preference, and ultimately, good versus bad. Sure, we can choose to view everything that happens to us without value applied, and in doing so put no value on life itself. That is in fact the prescription given by many who seek to enlighten the ignorant as to the source of their suffering. But is putting no value on life really the best way, or more importantly, the only way to eliminate suffering? If this study were devoted to teaching others how to end suffering, which it is not, I think I might question a conclusion that asks us to not put any value on life itself. In trying to convince me there is no such thing as good and bad, others try to convince me that good and bad, and right and wrong only exist where the enlightenment of oneness has been lost, and that if we all were all enlightened, and shared our lives in the unity of oneness, we would never have any need for good and bad, or right and wrong. Again, I agree. This too is not hypocritical. But it is a bit utopian, which, for many, makes it problematic. The dream of utopia is a nice pillow to rest one's head upon when overwhelmed by the complexities that life has to offer, but the idea of utopia, amongst manifest entities that cannot help but bump into each other and step on each other's toes, in life-impacting ways, remains elusive. And while I agree that acknowledgement of good and bad leads to suffering, and that connecting to the unity of oneness is beneficial in many ways to alleviating suffering, I see unity as a state of mind that no manifest being can sustain in perpetuity, thus keeping a manifest utopia perpetually elusive. As manifest things, living within a three-dimensional world, we ultimately and eventually need to respond to our biological necessities and other physical, conscious waking needs, and cannot remain in a state of suspended animation, detached in unity, away from duality, indefinitely, 24/7, 365. I also don't see such a state as being all that human. In continuing this debate, others might agree to the unsustainable state of oneness and unity by a manifest human or a collective society, but point out that the polarities, dualities, and complexities of manifest existence are just a transient illusion of the mind, and that the simplicity and sameness of the unity of oneness is not. Thus, they claim that to be enlightened beings, we should focus our attention on the reality of intransient nothingness, or the formless, and not the illusion of transient everythingness, or forms. Once again, I agree. To become enlightened, oneness and unity can tell us a lot. To become enlightened, simplicity is divine. So I would agree and advise anyone and everyone to go ahead and pray, meditate, jog, do whatever it takes, whenever the need is present, in order to center and calm one's heart, soul, spirit, and mind in the serenity of oneness and unity. Do it for as long as necessary, or as long as possible. Then, when the physical needs of being a manifest entity in a three-dimensional world pull us out of that trance, in order to tend to the transient things that require tending, rejoin the rest of the population in the illusory world of existence with all its polarities, dualities, and sides, like good and bad, and right and wrong, because these concepts, I believe, are inescapable to any manifest, conscious, awake, living thing, whether they be denied by a delusional mind or accepted gracefully by a moderate mind, or dealt with in struggle and suffering by a misguided mind. The binary nature of the universe does not go away. The only thing that changes, the only thing we can change, is how we deal with duality. One way that people deal with good and bad is to dilute notions of good or bad by expanding the context or reference frame of whatever it is that is being labeled to a possible future where a bad thing is shown to lead to a good thing, or vice versa. Or, to expand context, back to the past, to show how something that was thought to be bad leads to something in the present that is being labeled good. Once again, I agree that such expanding of context or reference frame can make good and bad indeterminable. But, life is not lived in the past or the future, life is lived in the present moment of now. If we restrict our notions of good and bad to what is happening now, good and bad become course correction tools for those who have put value on life and want to navigate away from life detracting things and toward life affirming things. In a world where everything is just another link in a never-ending chain of causes and effects, the past doesn't matter, it's gone. The future doesn't matter either, it's not here yet. The only thing that matters is now. We should only judge good and bad by the moment, not by how far we can extend that context to include as many possible contributors to now as we can. Inclusion of an extensive context of causes and effects shows how no moment can be defined in the grand scheme of things. But in the small scheme of things, each moment carries untold importance to each individual experiencing that moment. In the small scheme of things, things matter. In this mandala, we don't move through life, life moves through us, like wet clothes through an antique wringer. Or, if turned 90 degrees, like an endless supply of sand through an hourglass. Or, like water being endlessly recirculated through a fountain. The past and the future are in essence the same, cosmic flux waiting to be consumed by a cosmic engine that is seen by humans as a manifest entity like a human body, i.e., life happening. Past doesn't matter, future doesn't matter. But, at the same time, without a past and a future, there is no now to be found between, just as there is no gray without light and dark. I believe the binary nature of existence to be inescapable by any manifest being. I also acknowledge that putting no value on life provides for an easy answer to a lot of perplexing questions that have their roots in duality, like the infinite subjectivity of good and bad. And I believe I am at least as good as any of the people I've ever met at being detached and indifferent about the consequences of our manifest encounters and how they may enhance or detract from the life of each of us. But, unlike many who view life and duality as filth to be washed away, or a fall from grace, I do not go so far as to view our manifest existence as such a finite prison in which we are trapped, with our only escape, and by extension, our only purpose in life, being liberation into the unsustainable realm of unity. I do agree that the more and the further we can remove ourselves from the physical world, the less need we will have for polarities and dualities, good and bad, and right and wrong. Likewise, the more we can remove ourselves from society, the less need we will have for polarities, dualities, good and bad, and right and wrong. Likewise, the smaller we can make any given society, the less need we will have for polarities, dualities, good and bad, and right and wrong. In short, the closer we can get our society to embrace the utopian vision of sharing our lives in the unity of oneness, the less need we will have for the polarities and dualities or things like good and bad, and right and wrong. But the harsh reality is that such utopia does not exist. It never has, and probably never will, or would not be sustainable in perpetuity if it ever did come about. The harsh reality is that most of us live within imperfect societies, with large numbers of people who foolishly put value on life. We always have, and probably always will. Thus, I see concepts like good and bad not as an evolutionary error of society losing its way from a former utopian ideal it once had in a more primitive era, or as something evil to be denied, but as necessary realities to be dealt with and discussed, whether as an individual, a partner, or a society, alone, binary or collective. Good and bad are infinitely subjective and totally relative. But within a lot of imperfect, unenlightened societies of mortal humans throughout history, there are usually certain things that a huge majority of people agree on as good and bad. Those things usually focus on whether something is life-affirming or life-perpetuating versus life-threatening, or life-degrading, relative to our basic human needs. That may be a view that some see as an earthbound, manifest, unenlightened, mortal perspective, but that is in fact where a huge majority of people are in this world. As much of a mistake or fall from grace as different spiritual philosophies might teach this perspective to be, most people do value life, whether relative to needs or wants. Even when acknowledged as part of a cycle of life and death and reincarnation, and being told that to value life is to cling to it like an addiction rather than seeing it as a cycle, most people value life. As ridiculous as that might sound to the enlightened people of the world who think they know what happens to us outside of this earthly existence, or claim to, these earthbound people put great value on life. And in the process of imposing their values about life upon life itself, they end up deciding the good and bad of many things by how it affects life in general. They will consistently and persistently ask of all things, does it degrade or affirm? Does it negate or perpetuate? Does it make life easier or harder? Does it give what is wanted and or needed, or take away and deny? Does it lighten the mood or darken the mood? Does it tickle the pleasure nerve or yank on the pain nerve? Does it lead to a smile or a frown? People smile and frown on their own, independent of any imposed values given to them by a society or spiritual philosophy, or a deck of cards. It's an automatic response born from an innate, inborn understanding of the value of staying alive. A smile is a physical manifestation that indicates satisfaction or contentment or acceptance of what is, given the resolution of consequences regarding wants and needs, relative to a context or bias of life-affirming criteria. These are mechanisms of survival that appear to have been genetically hardwired into us. Why? To survive. Why? To be here, now. Why? Because that is what being here is all about, being here. We can be here, or not be here. But if we're going to be here, then the hardwired message appears to be that we should actually be here, with every fiber of our being. And that we should put value on the things of diversity that, by not stepping on our toes or killing us, keep us here, and keep us wanting to be here. Thus, things that are life-threatening, life-inhibiting, or life-detracting elicit a frown, and things that are life-affirming, life-liberating, or life-enhancing elicit a smile. In a lot of societies, majority rules. So, whatever makes the most people smile is often considered good, and whatever makes the most people frown is considered bad. From there, we give birth to the concepts of right and wrong. And from there, we establish rules and laws that officially declare what the majority believes to be good or bad, so that people know the difference, and can use that information in the development of their own reasoned responses and choices. Some things, however, sit right on the line between good and bad or right and wrong, and are eternally debated as good or bad. Other things, though, are obviously placed to one side or another. Between societies, things that a majority of people place in the same obvious locations, again and again, without fail, are considered archetypally rooted in a universal consciousness. This is in fact one important reason why the numerical tarot deck being presented everywhere in this study has such high contrast in its illustrations. A wisdom system that is attempting to embrace as full and complete a spectrum of human experience as possible should find out what those obvious, archetypal things are, and feel safe that in illustrating them on cards in a tarot deck, they are presenting a picture of life that a great majority of people will recognize. In other words, a wisdom system that draws equally from both smile and frown will be illustrating a picture of life that makes sense to the widest possible audience. We can, if we choose, retreat to the comfort of unity where good and bad don't exist, whenever we are overwhelmed by the pains of being a conscious, physical, mortal human, or when we are confused by the relativistic nature of conflicting values. There is indeed no such thing as good and bad when we live like a god or goddess in the utopian bubble of unity, away from duality. But, as mentioned earlier, for most of us mortal beings, that is an unsustainable state for our physical, conscious leaning, manifest forms to maintain over a complete lifetime 24/7, 365. It can be a valuable and useful form of anesthesia that can temporarily eliminate all notions of pleasure or pain, but in such a state, are we really being human? When our mind and body exist, in essence, as a lifeless corpse that does not interact in a conscious or physical way with the conscious and physical world around us, are we really being as fully human as we can possibly be? I think not. I think that to be fully human, we would need more balance in life. Thus it is that I see the needs of our physical, conscious, human nature as something that will always pull us out of any utopian state of emotionally detached anesthesia, and demand that we deal with the consequences of our place amid other physical entities, interacting in various life-perpetuating and life-threatening ways. Basically, this whole subject boils down to this. When we care, good and bad exist. When we don't care, good and bad don't exist. It's all about ever-shifting perceptions. Can you stop your perceptions from shifting? Can you decide to not care about anything, ever, in order to avoid the trap of thinking about things in terms of good and bad? With this in mind, we could sum up this whole good and bad discussion with this simple meme. Care more, live less. Care less, live more. The more you care, the more you fret and agonize over consequences. The less you care, the more free you are to enjoy life free of all value judgments and fears. The problem comes from how totally hardwired most people are to caring. To not care seems mean and heartless, or even stupid. Who wants to be that way? We have to care. And so we do. And so we suffer. Likewise, the problem with not caring is how accepting of death we need to be. Who wants to be that way? Who wants to not care about dying? Who wants to let suffering just go on? We value life, so we suffer. Strange. So, when you care, you suffer, but you might live longer by applying good and bad value judgments to things and thereby avoiding danger. And when you don't care, you are free, but you might die tomorrow by not applying good and bad values to things and thereby walking right into danger. What a choice! Good luck! Because luck is what we will need, because, as soon as we emerge from the anesthetizing utopia of emotionally detached unity, shit happens. In this way, one could actually argue that the utopian ideal we are told to strive for is itself a prison from which the tiniest step off of emotionally detached neutrality leads back to the dreaded notions of life affirmation or detraction. Again, an idea discussed in the previous video. In this way, the utopian ideal of unity is like a tiny, tiny island amid an ocean of duality and other binary realities. Thus, in striving for utopia, we find that the grass therein is not necessarily greener. Like an island amid an ocean of life-affirming and life-detracting dualities, we can detach, separate and anesthetize ourselves from life, and even reality. While detached and anesthetized, we may remain indifferent to the idea of having our toes stepped on. We may even be capable of enduring pains that end our devalued life completely. But again, is that really living? Is being indifferent to life and death to the point that we lay down and die, rather than show any bias to liking anything, like living, really what living is about? It may be good therapy for breaking the mind of the addictive worrier with chronic depression, but to argue the complete denial of good and bad shuts out a tremendous amount of life and living. When we are indifferent toward life, we are divine. When we are biased toward life, we are human. So, given this relativistic nature of good and bad, how do we determine what is good and what is bad? Answer: you can't, for everyone. But you can, for anyone. You can't, for everything. But you can, for anything. You can't, for every moment. But you can, for any moment. Just because we can't define what good and bad is for everyone and everything in every moment, doesn't mean that we shouldn't define what good and bad is for anyone, or anything in any moment. We simply need to acknowledge the context of things like who, what, where, why, when, and how. Life in duality is an endless stream of binary decisions being processed by our course correction instincts and intuitions. The numerical tarot is an attempt to give tangible form to this mental process. By organizing a deck of images according to how they might portray the mental process of sorting through binary influences, we have a tool to use in becoming more adept at knowing our own mind. Beyond the tarot deck itself, we have other tools of perception covered in previous videos, like the binary influence calculator, a device helpful to the task of sorting out binary influences, and the dream analysis calculator. Lots of people will attempt to convince others that there is no such thing as good and bad in tarot or anywhere. When they do this, don't look them in the eye, look them in the mouth. See if they smile or frown when attempting to persuade. I know I smile and frown. All the people I know smile and frown. All the illustrations, paintings, and photographs I see of people from societies gone by have smiles and frowns. Some people fly to the sun, extreme smile, and crash back to earth, extreme frown. Some just smile and frown. Some, while meditating their way to the transcendent utopian unity of oneness, neither smile nor frown. Let's talk about the whole dynamic, the full spectrum of human experience. That's where one of my interests lies, in exploring the capabilities and limitations of any wisdom system, like the Rider-Waite-Smith Tarot deck for example, and asking, is it a pure and unadulterated portrayal of naturally born and archetypally based smiles and frowns? Or does it portray a reasoned response to life, developed over time, to express a lopsided perspective with a personal bias? Does it give equal representation to both smile and frown and everything in between? Or is it a one-sided representation of smiles? If I should happen to choose frowns, will I find as many of them as I find of smiles? Or will I encounter an imbalance, a bias? In most tarot decks, I see a bias. In the way most people use tarot, I see a bias. By putting a positive spin on every bad thing, they think they are being neutral, when in fact they are presenting an all-good bias. By only presenting one point of view, they think they are presenting a neutral point of view. Is this what tarot was meant to be? Or can it be something else? The approach being presented here is an alternative for those who appreciate balance, symmetry, contrast, and consistency. So tell me, did you like this video? Are you currently smiling or frowning? Or, in YouTube terms, are you going to smash the like button, or will you dislike? I hope you are smiling. In the meantime, thanks for watching. Hope it all made sense. Links to eBooks, decks and merchandise below. And, if anyone is interested in drawing a deck based on this system of organization, don't hesitate to contact me for a collaboration.